Today we are using the HTML tools package to build this user interface. As you can see, it looks like a phone where a weather app is opened, and we'll build this with all the tools that HTML tools gives us. Building this will help you to sharpen your HTML and CSS knowledge, and it will help you to learn more about how to create something like this from within R. In my Quarto file, I've already put in a code chunk that has the completed code, and all of the completed code is saved into a variable called finished UI, and we can call it whenever we want to have a look at the finished image, and that way we can compare our current progress with the finished image. And with that said, we are ready to start working on our first draft. So let's first remove that variable here from our code chunk, because we can always put that stuff into the console if we want to see the finished image. And then let us sketch out the user interface with a couple of containers. So the first thing we need is a div container for the phone together. Let's call this phone container. We'll actually not use these IDs here because we'll put in inline CSS styles, but it's good to sketch out the user interface like this using the IDs. Let's style this container a bit by setting the style argument, and in there we specify the width and the height of the container. And for now, let's just put this to a gray background. And if we execute this, we will see that we get the HTML code in our console, which is really not what we want. So let us pass our div to the browsable function. And once we use that way we see the output inside of our viewer window. So right now this is a gray container, which is not what we want. Let's have a look at our finished image again, and we can see here all the parts that we need. First, we need a container for the top bar that contains the time and the icons. So let's just throw in a div with the ID top bar. Then we need something for the location and the location icon. We'll need something for the temperature and the rain forecast. We'll also need something for the big logo that we see in the middle. And we'll also need something which contains the forecast for the next 3 days. Even though we have put that in there, the image still looks the same because we haven't filled any of those divs here. And before we begin, let us first style our canvas a little bit so that our phone looks a little bit nicer. What we want to do here is to first replace this background with something else. For example, we could get rid of this and replace this with a linear background, which would look something like this. Here we set the background CSS to a linear gradient, which is a gradient with a 45-degree angle between these two colors, which are really similar blue shades, so that we do have a gradient, but it's really subtle. And this is usually a good way to make a nice looking user interface with a gradient that is not so in your face and not super weird, something which is subtle. And once we have that, we can throw in a border. We can also make it round. That way it looks a little bit more like a phone and less like some brick that we carry around. This looks actually pretty close to our finished UI. Let's have a look at the final image again. If we look at the finished image, it looks a bit wider. But also one particular thing that we notice is that the texts are not directly adjacent to the borders of the rectangle, which means that we need a little bit of padding. So let's throw this in there. And that way our canvas also has the correct width compared to our final image. And if you look at the finished UI again, you will probably notice, maybe not, but I will just tell you, the fonts here are not the typical fonts that you usually have by default. I've set this to Source Sans Pro. And of course, we have to set color to white here in order to get the white text. So that's how we have set up our base container, so that all the text inside of there are white and have the right font family. This reminds me, this video was a ton of work. If you get a lot of value out of this, don't forget to hit that like button. And also, if you're up for it, feel free to leave a comment. I'm always happy to hear your feedback on the videos. Okay, cool. Now that we have figured this out, let us have a look at what our finished UI needs. Let's start out with the top bar. What do we need inside of our div for the top bar? What we need there is a string for the time and also a couple of icons. The string for the time is really easy. We just have to throw in the time in there. Let's just put in 11:38. And then notice that the icons are grouped together. So let's throw them into another div container here. Now to get icons, it's really easy. We just have to use a function from the Shiny package, which has a function called icon. And it does exactly what you'd guess. It gives you icons. All you have to do is put in an icon name from the Font Awesome icons. And here this could look something like the signal icon, the Wi-Fi icon, and the battery 3/4 icon. All of these names I have extracted from the Font Awesome webpage, where I looked for 3 icons I can use. And when I execute this, I get icons which are not aligned correctly yet, but at least the icons are in there. So what we can see in our code here is that we have the time here, and in our container it has the icons. And by default in HTML, these things will be placed below each other. But we want to have it next to each other. So what we need is to make the parent container into a flex box. So that is why we set the style argument using the CSS function. And in there we set display to flex. And we can immediately see that the icons and the time are next to each other now instead of on top of each other. And in the final image, we have seen that the icons are all the way to the right and the time is all the way to the left. In the Flexbox system, this is a telltale sign that you need justified content with space between. So if you execute this, then the spacing is done exactly like we want. Now let's have a look at our finished user interface again. And there we can see that the icons are actually a bit larger and so is the time. And also one thing you might notice is that the icons are not so close together as they are right now. Right now they are really tight together, so we should put in a bit of margin into each icon. Here I simply put in a margin left of 5 pixels in there. And if we execute this, everything is stretched out a little bit. And now to make everything a little bit larger, let us just, inside of our CSS that we use to style the surrounding container, let us just throw in a font size and set this to 20 pixels and make the font weight to 600, which corresponds to bold text. And now everything looks like in the image that we're going for. Let's check. Yep, the top bar looks exactly the same. Sweet, now let us move on to our location container, which corresponds to the text Milwaukee, Wisconsin and this location icon. What we'll need to put into this container is the text Milwaukee, Wisconsin, followed by an icon again. In this case, we'll use the location dot icon, and if we execute this, we can see that everything is really close to each other. You know, you see that Milwaukee, Wisconsin doesn't have any margin on top. We should fix that, but let's work on the text first here. Right now, the icon is really close to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and also it should be larger. So let us set the style where we use margin left and set it to 10 pixels. And we'll also use the font size value and set it to 32 pixels. And that way, at least the icon became larger. And to do the same thing for the main text, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, let us throw in a style argument as well. And in there we set the font size and the font weight. So the sizes look okay now, but again, everything is kind of way too close together. So let's throw into our top bar here. Let us style this by using a margin bottom and setting the margin at the bottom to 30 pixels. And that way the text moves down a little bit. Okay, let's have a look what we need next. It looks like as the next thing we need is the current temperature, the forecast rain, and then the minimum and maximum temperatures. So since all of this is text, it can go all in one line and one div container, but we have to use these inline span tags to make sure that each part that we have in here can have some custom styling. You see the font sizes are completely different and we need to account for that. So this is why we'll put this 22 degrees, this rain, and this min-max thing into separate span tags. So let's scroll to our temp container. This is where this part should live in. And then in there, let us throw in the span tags. So for each entry, we will put in one span tag, one for the 22 degree, one for rain, and one for the min-max. And if we execute this, well, this doesn't look great. So let's start out by making the current temperature large. Let's set the style argument and in there set the font size to 100. And let's also make this bold. Conveniently, setting the font size to something so large also gave us a little bit of margin between the current temperature and the Milwaukee, Wisconsin label, which is kind of nice. We didn't have to worry about margins so much. And then we also modified the sizes of the rain and the min-max stuff. And that way the text became a little bit larger. But this doesn't look particularly nice, does it? So let us, for the rain and this min-max temperature, let us throw in margin left of 10 pixel in both places. And that way both of these move a little bit to the right. And this looks much nicer. At least it looks less squished together, which is always something I'm trying to go for. Okay, next in our code, it looks like we have to use the forecast icon. Let us have a look at the finished picture. And really, it is just one huge icon. We don't even need a div container for that. We could just throw in an icon just like we did before. So let's get rid of the container here. It served as well to give all of this code a little bit of structure, but now we can fill it with just the icon. So once again, from the Shiny package, we call the icon function and use the cloud rain icon, which looks exactly like the icon that we want. What a surprise that I chose the right one. Guess I came prepared. In any case, let us make this larger. We set the style argument and the font size to something huge. And now it looks better, but we should leave a little bit of room on top. So let us throw in a margin top to move the icon a little bit down. Right now the icon isn't centered and we should fix that. And this brings us to the age-old question, how do we center anything in HTML and CSS? And it depends really what you want to do, whether it is horizontal or vertical, or what kind of element you want to center. In this case, we want to center just one icon. So what we could do is to simply make this into a block display, which in itself will not change anything. But since this is a block now and not an inline element, we can use the text align argument and in there set this to center, which will center the current text in the middle of the current line. This is actually a good solution which works very well in this case, but it's not very generalizable. In other cases, you might run into trouble using this approach. So let me just show you a different one. So let's remove that and instead let us work with flexboxes. You see, with flexboxes, you can use auto margins to make something align automatically. So what I would do here is to use margin right and set it to auto, and use margin left and set it to auto as well. And if I execute this, everything goes back to the way it was before. So right now our centering approach doesn't work. And as I've said, we need to use flexboxes for this to work. And right now, the surrounding container that contains our icon is not in fact a flexbox. At least I don't see any flex in here, so this is why we need to throw this in there. But since we've used flex boxes before for the top bar, we know what the effect will be. You see, we use flex boxes for the top bar to make everything align horizontally and not go on top of each other. So if we put in display here and set this to flex, then predictably everything will look like a mess. Let's have a look. Yep, it's a mess. Everything goes next to each other. And this is why we can set the flex direction, and there you set it to column. And once you execute this, everything goes back to normal. It is a flex box, but the direction is column wise, and therefore everything is the way it was before. But now it is a flex box so that the auto margins work. Let me just remove this for a second. See, this is the thing we have without the auto margins, and this is the thing we have when we put in the auto margins. And if I just remove one of those things, one of the auto margins, then everything would be left aligned. And if I remove the other one, let's just do this here for a second. If I comment this out, then everything would be right aligned. So you see, auto margins is quite a useful tool. And here we've used it to center things. But remember, it works only inside a flexbox. Okay, we've actually gone pretty far already. Let's have a look what we still need. Let's have a look at the finished UI, and really the only thing we need is this container here that has the forecast for the next 3 days, and also something that looks like you could swipe to the right and to the left here. We haven't actually implemented here, we just want to make it look like you could. And the trick here is to just use circles here and put them next to each other. So what we need to do here is to fill this div container where we want to put in the stuff for the next 3 days. So to fill this container, let us just first throw in a bit of generic text, some lorem ipsum, to have some text in there so that the container is visible, and work just on the style first, and then we'll work on each row individually. So this means that we set the style argument and then just throw in some keywords that we've already used a couple of times. So I will just go over them quickly. Right now, if we don't do any styling, we'll just have some lorem ipsum in there. That's not particularly good. So let's just put in a background, and we can also put in a border radius. Let's just also put in a bit of margin on top and a bit of margin on the left, and of course a bit of margin on the right too. And that way we have a container where we can throw in stuff. So let's leave in the lorem ipsum for a second and work on the dots that we need for our finished user interface. And to throw these in there, we'll just need a couple of icons again. So what we do is to add another container, and in there we just throw in the icons. Notice that one of the icons is filled, and we can get this effect by just using the solid class for one of the icons. So this means we'll use the icon function from Shiny again. And here we want to get the circle icon, and for the one that is to be filled, we'll use the FA solid class, which is the font awesome solid class, which will give you a solid instead of not solid circle. So this means we'll get the filled one. And then we throw in the other ones too. And if we look at this right now, we see that we get our circles in there and we have one of those built just like we want. And now to make them look a little bit nicer, let us throw in the style argument and put in the margin bottom and font size argument to make the circles a little bit smaller and also leave some room below them. And now we need to center these circles, and we have just learned a trick to do this. Namely, we have to put in auto margins on this container, but we have to make sure that the surrounding container has display flex inside. So let's put this in there. And if we execute this, we get things next to each other, but just like before, we want to get the flex direction and set it to column instead. So this means that all we have to do is to throw in margin left and margin right again. Let's just copy this part here, throw this in there. Let's align this. And then we set this part to auto and this part as well. And now we have nicely centered circles in there. Now the last thing that is missing is to exchange the lorem ipsum with the actual stuff we want to display here. So here we have 3 rows, each of them contains an icon, a word like today, tomorrow, Monday, and a min-max for the temperatures. And as you can see, the icon and the label, they are quite close together, and then there's a lot of room, and then we have all of the min-max temperatures below each other. Here all we have to do is to use the same trick as we did in the top bar, which means that if we want to get a row and have one part at the beginning and one part at the end of the row, we'll use a flex box and then use an appropriate justify content argument. And since we have to do this 3 times, let us actually create a function that generates 1 row, and then we can keep our code clean by using only this function inside of our container here. So this is why we scroll all the way to the top and throw in another code chunk. In that code chunk, we can create a function, let's call it one day row. As I said, it will be a function, and the 3 arguments we'll have for that function will be the icon. I've set it to a default of cloud rain. It will be the day that we want to use. I've set it to a default of today, and it will be a temperature argument. And here I've set a default as well, but it doesn't matter. We can put in any values we want. And what this function is supposed to return is a div container. Basically, one row is one div container, and inside of that div container, we have 2 div containers, one for the left part, the icon and the today. So it will be the icon in there, and it will be the label for today, tomorrow, Monday. And then we'll also need another container for the temperatures. And now to align this container here and the other one, we have to set the style argument of the surrounding container of the surrounding row. But of course, we can also set individual styles for the icon and the span text. Here, let's just use a margin right and a vertical align. And here we use a margin right as well. This will just give us a bit of spacing between the icon and the label here. And for the temperature container, we actually don't need that. So we can skip right to the styling of the parent container. And as I said, there is where the arrangement of the left and right part happens. So in there we throw in the usual stuff like the font sizes and the font weight we want to use. We also throw in a bit of margin to have some space between the rows. And then we go to the alignment by making it into a flex container. And we use the space between argument for justify content. This argument is a little bit different than the one we've used before. You see for the top bar, we have used a different one, which will put the 2 contents at the end of the lines. But space between will actually split the 2 containers, the one that has the icon and the text, and the one that has the temperature, min and max. It will space out these 2 containers evenly on the row. So it's a little bit different, but don't worry about it too much. In any case, this completes our function. It gives us 1 row, and now we can go back to our previous code and use this function inside there. And that way we avoid a lot of code duplication by using this function here. So now whenever we feel unhappy with the design of the rows, we can just change it in the function and don't have to change it repeatedly. So let us scroll all the way down again to where the circle icons were. And on top of that, we need to throw in the rows. So what we do here is to use another container and throw in the 3 rows that we want. And if we execute this, we'll have something like this. We should get rid of the lorem ipsum as well. Let's have a look how this one looks now. This doesn't look particularly nice now, so let us throw in a bit of margin in there. And now the rows have a little bit of more room around it, but the circles are not properly aligned now. And the reason why this has happened is because this part here is actually supposed to go outside of the container where only the circles are in. Right now everything is in one container, but we want to actually have this here. Now this looks better now, and if we execute this, our circles are nicely aligned again. Sweet, I believe with that we are finished. Let us have a look at our finished user interface, and it looks exactly the same. If you enjoyed this video, you may also enjoy this one here or this one here. Both are fine, and if none of those are for you, check out the links in the description. Maybe you'll find something in there for you. With that said, have a nice day and see you in the next video.